Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be going over the brief history and geography of Afghanistan. Let me just start off with geography before we get into the history. As you can see, Afghanistan is incredibly mountainous. Let me get a pencil to help me point out. You can see right here it says the Hindu Kush, which is the name of this big mountain range that just flows from the Himalayas and just spills out all over this area of Afghanistan. And these big high mountains get a lot of snow on top, and when it melts down, it creates rivers and valleys. And all throughout the mountains here, there are some incredibly lush valleys that are perfect for farming and are really, really beautiful landscapes. You think this corner of the world, you kind of think more desert, but it's really lush and green in these valleys between the mountains here. Speaking of this corner of the world, Afghanistan is bordered by Iran over here. It's bordered by Turkmenistan up here. Here's Uzbekistan. Has this border with Tajikistan. It has a tiny little border with China right here, and this border is with Pakistan. The border with Pakistan is called the Durand Line, which I'll briefly mention in its history. It's quite a point of contention because it, kind of like some African nations, it was drawn up without really any geopolitical consideration in mind, so it split some people's land in half between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Mainly people of Pashtun descent, which is the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. And in this part of Pakistan, there's also a very large Pashtun population because of the Durand Line. The line up here, though, just follows a river. And Afghanistan does have this big peninsula. It looks like there's no water. It's a landlocked country, so there's no water, so it's not a peninsula. It's just this big little piece of land jutting out from the rest of Afghanistan. It's called the Wakhan Corridor, and it also is full of very high mountains and very lush green valleys and rivers and things like that. I'll just mention briefly during its history why this is here. It's kind of odd, but we'll see if I have time to throw it in there. Let's talk about cities. The largest city would be the capital city right here of Kabul. Kabul sits near a very important place in another geopolitical thing. Right here is the Khyber Pass, which is a pass in the mountains that can lead into Pakistan and thus India and all of that. So Kabul sits right kind of at the entrance of a big valley where people can pass in. Kandahar is also a large city. We have Herat over here, Balkh. A lot of the places I'm going to mention its ancient history, Balkh was the capital of those places. But there are lots of really large, very interesting, very old cities in Afghanistan. Kabul in particular, nobody knows who or when it was built. It's that old. It predates written history. And let's see what else. Oh, so besides the mountains, you can see the region all around it is fairly flat looking because it is, especially this part down here. This is called, I believe it's the Registan, and it's a very flat, barren, sandy desert. There's really not much there, as you can see. There's only really towns along the river here, and this river is the Helmand River. It's the longest river within Afghanistan. It flows, let me see, it's kind of hard to see with all the mountains there, but it flows down from the mountains and goes down there into Iran. It's a pretty long one, not really navigable, but a very long river. So in a nutshell, really, that's the basic geography of Afghanistan. I wanted to do that kind of quick because the history is pretty intense. Afghanistan has an incredibly long and complicated history. Basically, since the beginning of human history, people have just been conquering this area and taking over, establishing empires. After a couple hundred years, that empire gets overthrown by another empire. There are literally over I want to say 20 to 30 different kingdoms and empires and what have you have reigned over what is now Afghanistan today. And I'm not going to cover all of them. I'm just going to really only talk about the big important ones, basically. So if you're looking for an intense breakdown history of Afghanistan, this is not going to be it. I'm going to skip over some pretty big chunks just for the sake of time, for the sake of relaxation. And yeah, I don't want to make a 2-hour video on Afghanistan. After we do history, I'll flip through this book and I'll show you some neat pictures of Afghanistan. The name's too long to get in the frame, but that's okay. Afghanistan, there we go. Anyway, so with that being said, like I said, I will skip over things. Don't be shocked if I just skip over a couple hundred years at a time, various points in this talk. So anyway, humans would have first come into this area around 50,000 years ago. Some of the first farms ever were established in what is now Afghanistan. Civilizations would have started popping up sometime around 3000 BCE. And they did have contact and influence from the Indus Valley civilization, which I've already done a whole video on. They were a very interesting civilization. They even had a town within the borders of what is now Afghanistan. Around 2000 BCE, the Indo-Iranians would have moved in, establishing a region known as Arya or Ariana. And then in the northern area up here was a kingdom that was called Bactria. Just keep that in mind. Moving on, skipping ahead in history, around the 6th century BCE, the Achaemenid Empire would have taken over, which is more commonly known as the Persian Empire, which I've already covered Iran on my channel, so I talk in depth in quite a few videos about the Persian Empire. It's one that I find really, truly fascinating. So they took over this region and implemented the Zoroastrian religion. It was really big here at this time. By 330 BCE, Alexander the Great defeated Darius III for the control of the Persian Empire. He swept through here. He even established cities. He even married a princess from Bactria because he had some pretty difficult battles in this area. The Bactrians really put up a fight against Alexander. But take over he did. He passed not long after that, and his empire was divided up between his generals. So the dynasty of his generals that took over this area would have been the Seleucids. They controlled until 305 BCE when it was incorporated into the Mauryan Empire, which was an Indian empire. It was eventually retaken over by the Bactrians, but now they are known as the Greco-Bactrians because they had that influence from Alexander the Great. There was truly like a Greek culture happening in this corner of the world, so they took over most of the territory again. The Scythians would have come in the 2nd century BCE, and they really dominated the Silk Road trade. So, side note about the Silk Road. One of the reasons that this corner of the world is constantly being conquered and controlled is that it sits right smack dab in the middle of some very important trading places in the world. We have India just down there with all of its connections. We have China up here with all of its connections. We have what was then basically Persia, now Iran, with all of their connections. And it was right in the middle. So the Silk Road, which was the trade route that went from China to Europe, passed through Afghanistan. It made the area very wealthy and very politically important. So whoever controlled this region, Afghanistan as it's known today, controlled the Silk Road, controlled the big trade, all of the money, all of everything. So this area was very, very vastly important, and the Silk Road's a good example as of why it was so important. It's still, I mean, this concept will come up later in its history about why just this spot on the globe politically is very important. Let's keep that in mind. Eventually, the Parthians would have come in. Like I said, I've already skipped over a bunch of other people who have conquered. They were overthrown by the 1st century BCE by the Kushan Empire, which was a really interesting empire made up of various ethnic groups coming from Western China that were thrown out by the Chinese fighting over there. They migrated this way, established their own empire, and they brought Buddhism with them, and it really took off in the area. There's lots of really amazing Buddhist artifacts from this era of time. And by the 3rd century, the Sassanid Empire would have taken control, another Persian-influenced empire. In 642, now CE, was the first instance of Islam coming into the country. After many other overthrows and takeovers and what have you, in the 11th century, the Ghaznavids were the ones to come to power, and they were based out of the town of Ghazni, which, is it on this map? Ghazni, there it is, yes. That's where they were based. And they were like hardcore Muslims. They really implemented it into the society where it still exists to this day. It's still definitely the dominant one. Some of the empires that had controlled before were Hindu dominated. The Ghaznavids really focused on getting them out of power and establishing Islam as the primary religion, which they were successful in doing. Islamization was successful, and it still is there today. After many other takeovers, what have you, in 1219 Genghis Khan came in and completely wiped out this whole area. In particular, like Balkh was erased. The Mongols destroyed everything, right? Killed everyone in their path, burned down everything in their path. By 1370, a descendant of Genghis Khan named Timur or Tamerlane would have established the Timurid Empire. A lot of pros and cons with that, in that he really built up the architecture, infrastructure, arts and culture, but also he slaughtered a lot of people, so what have you. Moving ahead in history to the early 16th century, when Babur, who would eventually establish the Mughal Empire in India, captured Kabul. And over time in history, again we're skipping ahead a bit, this section was ruled by the Mughal Empire, and this section over here was ruled by the Safavids, which was the current reigning empire in what is now Iran. This area at the time was known as Khorasan also. Afghanistan is, as a name is about to come up, Afghan apparently is a diminutive of Pashtun. So this means like land of the Afghans or land of the Pashtuns. But anyway, just a side note. Various tribal leaders ousted the Safavids in 1709. So this is where we get into like the tribal leader section, where there are so many. I'm not even going to bother really naming any of them except the extremely important ones. And there were a lot of them, so just keep that in mind. Just picture like 20, 30 or so different tribes vying for power for the next 300 years or so. The biggest, baddest one would have been Nader Shah. He took over the area in 1729, basically invaded everything. He plundered Delhi, he invaded India. He was like a really brilliant military leader, but very brutal in his methods. Very brutal. He was assassinated in 1747, and the person who was selected to take over as him was named Ahmed Shah Durrani, which was the start of the Durrani Empire. He invaded India a couple times, captured some Mughal areas, and he's considered the father of Afghanistan. He's the one that pretty much set up the territory of what is now Afghanistan today. After he died, a civil war broke out between the whole Durrani family, the first of many civil wars to come. The result of all of this civil war was, in 1823, a man named Dost Muhammad Khan declared himself emir. He declared this the Emirate of Afghanistan, which is, now we have the name. And it was this period where the Great Game began. So, down here, because this isn't Pakistan, this is India back then, was controlled by the British. This territory up here was being taken over by the Russians, and they were slowly encroaching down into this territory. The Britons down here were like, uh-oh, like they're coming, right? So we got to stop them. So they were like, let's just take over this country, because that's what Britain's good at. They just take over stuff. And they arrested Dost Muhammad Khan, and it started a huge war between the Afghans and the British. It was a rough one. The fallout from that was the Afghan Civil War from 1863 to 69, because of all the chaos that the British left behind. Dost Muhammad was reinstated, which the British didn't like. A second war started not long after he died, when the British tried to take over. That ended in an agreement with Afghanistan to become a British protected state, but not part of the British Empire. Afghanistan would govern itself. Then the leader of Afghanistan, just after World War I, invaded India. That sparked the Third War with the British, and that ended with a treaty signed on August 19th, 1999, where Afghanistan would become internationally recognized as an independent state. They were led by Emir Amanullah Khan, and in 1926 he rebranded the country to the Kingdom of Afghanistan and declared himself king. And during that time between independence and then indefinitely after it became a kingdom, there was a lot of modernization in the area. And things like, roads, buildings, hospitals, schools, but also women's rights as well. And just all of the sort of almost like a Western kind of mindset toward modernization. This upset a lot of, like I mentioned, tribal leaders and stuff. A lot of religious leaders as well were very upset. This sparked a civil war that lasted from 1928 to 29. King Amanullah Khan abdicated in favor of Muhammad Zahir Shah, who also continued that path toward modernization. That kingdom was overthrown in 1973. The monarchy was abolished. Democracy started to happen, and then that government was overthrown in 1978 in the Saur Revolution. That led to the Soviets up here being very concerned, because they were basically supporting the whole modernization movement. They were the ones handing out the money so that Afghanistan could become more modern, and they were getting worried that there would be anti-Soviet leaders, so they invaded the country in 1979. A civil war had already sparked up, because whenever there's a drastic change, apparently there's a huge civil war. So they then started to fight the Soviets, and by they, I mean the term for them now was called the Mujahideen, and they were essentially like the freedom fighters, the rebels, the fringe groups that were fighting for their rights. The Soviet-Afghan war really stretched on. It was really a war of attrition in a way. The United States and the Pakistanis were supporting the rebels financially for various reasons. It was a pretty rough one. Even after the Soviets withdrew, the civil war still churned on, which technically it never stopped. One of those Mujahideen groups that established in 1994 is known as the Taliban. They, kind of like Genghis Khan did before, believed in more of like a scorched earth policy of just take over, destroy everything, and implement our rules. They took over Kabul in 1996 and established a very extreme Sharia law government that lasted until 2001. Because of all of this chaos and civil war, it was perfect for terrorist organizations to move in and set up shop and establish bases, which a lot of these Mujahideen groups would support. Pakistan would support some of them. One of them was Osama bin Laden. There was an event in 2001 which YouTube really doesn't want people to talk about. They're really particular about not mentioning the certain event, but I think we all know what it was in New York City in September, which was caused by Osama bin Laden. The United States told the Taliban government, hey, you have to hand him over, and they said no. So the United States invaded. Within 2 months, the United States and their allies had totally overthrown the Taliban government. The Taliban moved out to Pakistan and various places within the mountains. And a new government was set up, a more democratic one. They established a democratic constitution. Wow, I wrote down the wrong date. I think I meant to write 2004. I wrote 2014. That's very wrong. In 2004, they set up a new democratic constitution, and we're on the path to really trying to start anew. But in 2021, the U.S. announced that they were pulling out all of their troops finally. The U.S. occupation of Afghanistan was the longest conflict in United States history. It was really just dragging on and on and on. So they said, we're pulling out, and the Taliban really took advantage of that and started a massive offensive against the Afghanistan government. By the time the United States had fully pulled out, the Taliban moved in and took over the country once again. And essentially, this is where we are today. It's pretty rough right now at the moment. The Taliban government is really trying its hardest to set itself up as a fully official, recognized government. They just sent representation to the United States to be recognized, and the United Nations sent them on their way, saying they will not recognize this government. I don't think so. With this Taliban takeover, there are only a handful, I want to say like 3 countries that recognize the first Taliban government. I really don't think anyone has recognized this one yet. I mean, it's December 2021 that I'm filming this, so this literally just happened 3 months ago. The biggest issue would be that all of the humanitarian aid pulled out of Afghanistan because they didn't want to give money to the Taliban. And that has led to a widespread famine. It's looking to be a really huge humanitarian disaster. The economy is pretty much collapsed at this point, and we don't know what's going to happen, honestly, at this point. It's kind of a worrying time. It made reading this book really sad because this book was published in, I want to say like 2015-16, and it was saying like, oh, all of this change is coming and it's hopeful, and all of that was basically undone within a couple of months. So that is where Afghanistan is today. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say about it, honestly. It's a pretty dire situation, and hopefully there's a positive end. I mean, if we look at Afghanistan's history, basically their entire history is just people rising to power and someone else conquering them and taking over and rising to power. So eventually someone's going to come in and conquer at some point. We just don't know who or when or how. So anyway, finished it. I hope this was relaxing. I spent 3 weeks doing research for this talk to make sure I got everything right and could say it relaxingly. And I hope I said it relaxingly. I know I rush a few times when I'm trying not to rush, but anyway, let's relax and look through the book and see some pictures of Afghanistan. I'll show you some of this truly beautiful landscape. Here's a wonderful face right here. Here is the Blue Mosque. This is in Mazar-e-Sharif. Really beautiful, beautiful mosque. So kids having a fun time. Here's a political map of Afghanistan. You can basically see, even though it's a political map, you can see where all the valleys are. You can just like follow the city areas, and basically where there's no city areas, it's all mountains or desert in this area. We've got some street food. Looks like some naan maybe. Looks like me when I'm editing my YouTube videos, checking the sound quality. Some roads up high in the mountains, very treacherous looking drive. And here's a good example of what these mountains look like. Extremely rough and rocky, right? These mountains are new mountains, right, in terms of Earth's history. The Himalayas are some of the younger ones, so younger mountains are very sharp and abrupt and craggy like this. Newer mountains are rounder and smoother because they've been around longer. So you can tell newer mountains. I mean, obviously millions and millions and millions of years old, but newer in Earth's history, right? Here we can see a physical map. You can really see the mountains spilling out all right here. And all of the rivers, too. There's so many different rivers flowing through Afghanistan. Oh, that's the highest point. It wasn't on this map, so I didn't mention it. It is Mount Naushak, right here on the border, the Hindu Kush. Absolutely gorgeous scenery. So beautiful. So lovely. Here's a really beautiful lake. This is in Afghanistan has 2 national parks now. This is one of them. There's an example of what the desert area looks like down in the south. And it's a snowy day, playing in the snow. Here's the opposite, a big sandstorm. Ugh, sounds awful. Let's see, this is Kandahar down here. And this is the mosque. This is a mosque in Herat. It's not the mosque from the other one, but this one is just as beautiful. There's some flowers growing in the mountains. This guy's got some sticks. He's got a lot of them. This is wormwood, a very popular herb. It's used for a lot of medicinal purposes. Very beautiful, rare snow leopard. And look at this. I've never heard of this animal before reading this book. This is a saiga antelope. It looks like some kind of like Star Wars alien or like a weird Muppet or something. It looks like Gonzo almost. It's the weirdest looking thing. It's an antelope, but they have this big pouch on their nose. It inflates to help warm cold air. Very bizarre looking creature. It looks like an alien, right? Here's some Marco Polo sheep. They're the biggest sheep in the world. It's a Siberian crane. He got a really nice haircut. A Russian tortoise, isn't it sweet? And here's a family. This talks about the 2nd National Park, which I believe is its name, right? It's called the 2nd National Park. I'm pretty sure. Look how beautiful this is. This is an earring, it says. That is so gorgeous. I'm sure it's like this big, but look at the detail in it. Gorgeous. An ancient stone figure, it says. And this is a drainage system from the Indus Valley civilization. They basically created plumbing. They were the first to use plumbing. Oh, you know, I noticed it on here. I'm seeing in the words. So this is lapis, right? This blue stone. My whole life, I've called it lapis lazuli, which, like, if you can tell by the ring, I grew up in a Wiccan home. Stones were everything. I had to learn all the stones. So I've always said lapis lazuli, and then in doing research for various countries, I've heard lapis lazuli, lapis lazuli. Which one do you say? Because I think lazuli is like the more like European English version. I think lazuli is the more American version. I don't know. What do you all say? Because I don't even know at this point. This is a drinking cup from the Bactrian Empire. It's probably from the Bactrian Horde. Which I think, yeah, it talks about later in this book. It was basically a bunch of treasure that's been hidden to protect it from various invaders, mainly the Taliban at this point. Early Afghanistan. So the green is the Indus Valley civilization. The big peach-colored outline would be the Achaemenids. The purple is the Macedonian. That would have been Alexander the Great. The orange was the Mauryans, mainly in India here. And the yellow was the Kushans. This is a fortress built by Alexander the Great. Not himself alone, but by his forces, obviously. Here's a war elephant ready to go. Some camels on the Silk Road going through the valleys here. Here's a treasure from Bagram, a Kushan item of some kind, little statue. Later empires, so you can see some ones I skipped, like the Hephthalite Empire up here. The Sasanians are over here. They were mainly focused, yep, right here. And the Ghaznavid Empire that I mentioned, the first big Muslim empire big Muslim force. This is a Bamyan Buddha built by the the Kushans, I believe. Doesn't say in here, but unfortunately the Taliban blew up these statues. They're no longer there. This is Balkh, or what's left of it at least. Very ancient city. Here is Dost Muhammad with a friend. Or British troops coming through the pass to invade. Oh, I didn't mention this whole area and its history. So the Khyber Pass, again important because that's where the British would have invaded, among many other peoples, like too many to mention. And then the Wakhan corridor here. So the Russians established this line, the English established this line, and pretty much like both people didn't realize that these borders were never touching, except like right here. So it just stayed that way, just stayed part of Afghanistan. It talks about the Durand line right there. This is Amanullah Khan, first king of Afghanistan. This is his wife, Queen Soraya. Soviets invading. This is Ahmad Shah Massoud, who fought against the Soviets and later against the Taliban. There's some Taliban fighters right here. And some women wearing burqas, which the Taliban requires women to wear, among other things, like forcing how they live and such. Anyway, working hard in school. We've got new members of the Afghan parliament. Unfortunately, the new Taliban government has forced all women out of the government. Here's the flag. So let's break it down with a pencil. It says the flag of Afghanistan. No other country has changed its flag as often in 100 years as Afghanistan has. Today, the Afghan flag is made up of 3 equal vertical bands. The black band represents foreign occupations of the past. The red band symbolizes the blood of freedom fighters, and the green band symbolizes both agriculture and Islam. The national emblem sits in the center of the flag. The emblem consists of a mosque and a pulpit with flags on each side. Circling the emblem are sheaves of wheat and 2 inscriptions. Above are the words La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah, which means there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. Below this are rays of sun. Where are the rays of sun? Rays of sun. There they are. Rays of sun, and the words Takbir, meaning God is great. Below the emblem is the word Afghanistan and the year 1298. The year 1298 in the Islamic calendar is the same as the year 1919 in the Western calendar. This is the year Britain recognized Afghanistan's independence. Here's a map of Kabul and what the big city looks like. So when this book came out, these were the leaders of Afghanistan. They had an election in 2014, and it was a disputed election. And instead of deciding to spark another civil war and fight it out, they just agreed to be joint leaders. So this is President Ashraf Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah, and they worked together. We've got some soldiers here holding the flag. This person just voted. He's got his stamp there. This is Fauzia Kufi, a women rights advocate, the presidential palace. And this is a meeting of the Loya Jirga. So the Loya Jirga goes back, like thousands of years. It's a very traditional decision-making method before there was an official government controlling all of Afghanistan. So basically all of the town leaders of every town in the area would meet to make a big decision. And many decisions in Afghanistan's history were made by Loya Jirga. Like it says down here, they selected Ahmad Shah to be king, Hamid Karzai to be the first president after the Taliban fell, and approving the new constitution. among many other things in its history. It says they've been called upon to declare war, choose a ruler, make social reforms, so on and so forth. This guy's getting some wheat. Here's a big resources map. You can see the farming areas in the valleys. That's really neat. They're harvesting saffron. And this is where cashmere comes from. It comes from soft goat hair. I bet you didn't know that. I didn't. So in this valley, there's a huge archaeological site, but the land was sold to the Chinese to mine copper, because apparently it's one of like the biggest natural copper deposits in the world. So archaeologists been working hard to excavate what they can before China moves in. I can imagine how much history is buried under all the dirt and everything in Afghanistan. It must be remarkable. He's making some silk here. Their currency is called the Afghani. They are working with some pipes there, some big tubes. Those are construction workers. Father and son. A population map. You can see the majority of the population up in those valley areas. There's a brand new baby. These are Hazara women. They're at a protest. Hazaras are an ethnic group which are Shia Muslims, and the majority of Afghans are Sunni, so they face a lot of discrimination in that regard. Here's a map of all the different ethnic groups. You can really see the Pashtuns are in the light green. They're the largest one. These are Kyrgyz women in the Wakhan corridor getting some water. So she's writing in Dari, which is the second official language of Afghanistan. Praying, an important part of the day. A beautiful Quran. Very lovely, very intricate. These are Sufi men, which is a branch of Islam that I feel like I've mentioned twice on this channel, and apparently I've messed it up both times. It's like a mystical version of Islam in a way. I'll just leave it at that. There are people out there who know way more about it than I do. It's time, when it's time to pray, it's time to pray. You gotta stop what you're doing and pray. They're making some food for Eid al-Fitr, which is a fasting holiday. After the sun goes down, you just eat like crazy. So you gotta get the food ready. This is a ram. It says it's from the Bactrian horde, so it talks about it over here. Oil painting, you can tell it's very Indian influenced painting, so a Buddhist painting. So the Bactrian horde, like I said, is like a collection of artifacts from Afghanistan's history that's been protected and hidden and moved around for its safety. Graffiti artist. And a beautiful mosque again. That's the mosque in Herat again. A potter making some pottery. Some Afghan rugs. Look at these. They're like, wow, that's pretty, until you look closer and you see all the tanks and helicopters and then like the guns in there. Kind of sad, but very interesting to see such modern things incorporated into traditional art. You can see the missiles there, fighter jets in there. Very interesting. This is Humayun Saki. He is a traditional Afghan musician. And this is Mazda Jamalzada, who is a singer who works as a like a broadcast reporter now. It's a family out for the day. What's he got there? Some snacks of some kind. Okay, didn't skip a page. She's got some henna tattoos. She looks a little embarrassed about it. I think it's sweet. Shopping at the market. Is that cheese? Or a bowl of some kind? A biscuit factory, it says, where they employ children. Child labor is sadly still a thing in some parts of Afghanistan. And Afghan culture is one of those that have like massive weddings. Like if you show up, you aren't turned away. Like everyone's welcome. Let's see, this is Kalibi Palau, which is lamb and rice and other delicious looking things. guides made out of paper bags. Playing some soccer. Again, a very popular sport around the world. This is Rashid Khan, who's from Afghanistan. He plays cricket in India at a college. And this is Rula Ghazni, Ashraf Ghani's wife, who was a big advocate for women's education. And that's the end of our book. So anyway, that's going to be the end of the video today. I really hope this was relaxing, and I hope you learned something interesting. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you have a very good night. Good night. Good night.